Welcome. We have the great privilege and honor today to have with us the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who has been, among other things, the former Minister of Defense and actually also the Deputy Prime Minister of the nation that I call my own, Canada. Welcome, Paul.
It's nice to be with you.
You know, and I want to alert people that we have your new book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, a survival plan for the human species. And I think that that's what we'll be talking about today, and that's a very timely book. You write, and this is being recorded on July 13th, 2011. You write that the next world war, and this is a speech that you delivered in Arizona at the beginning of 2011, the next world war is actually going to be the bankers against the people. I'm sort of paraphrasing. It seems to me that that's very apt, given the drama that's going on now with threatened defaults in Europe, North America. Could you give us your thoughts of how we got to this position and how this is going to play out?
It's a long story, but let me say you're absolutely right. It is a war between the bankers and the people, but so far only the bankers are engaged. The people are not yet engaged. A few of us are trying to make a little noise and saying, hey, we have to do something or the future of the world is at stake. Certainly the welfare of humanity is at stake. So we're going to have to turn the tables on the bankers and take back our democratic right to look after our own affairs. But people aren't doing that yet. And there are reasons for it, of course. One of them is that probably only about one person and maybe every 100 understand what money is and where it comes from. And they have this peculiar notion that it's something sacrosanct and, money, you have to treat it with the respect that you give to the gods. And as a matter of fact, one of the chapters in my book, if you will remember, is that Mammon rules the world. Well, that is literally true. Mammon does rule the world. Gold rules the world, money rules the world, because the world is in the hands of an elite group of professional bankers who over 2.5 centuries have managed to set up what I call a Ponzi scheme, which is really basically a fraud in order to create money out of nothing, lend it to people, including governments, especially governments, and then charge them interest on it. And this is wrong, and it's got to be changed, because unless it is, the most important problem facing the world today, which is really global warming, is over as far as success is concerned. Because countries like the United States and Britain and France and Germany and Spain and all the others don't have the money in order to make the changes from an oil economy to a clean energy economy that are absolutely essential to stop global warming and save the planet as a hospitable habitat for the human species. So we're in this situation where we either have to act, and act quickly, or the planet's in very, very serious trouble. So if you want me to, I'll go back and maybe take a few minutes to explain a little bit about money and what it is. Basically,
yes, money, I think that would be very helpful.
Money is nothing more than a computer entry today. The first governor and the brightest of our governors of the Bank of Canada, Graham Towers, said that money was nothing but a book entry. But of course, he was talking in a day when they kept bank records in books, ledgers. If he were alive and talking about it today, he'd say all money is a computer entry. And this is a little hard for some of my friends to understand, how money is created. But let me take 5 or 10 minutes to sort of go through the process step by step. Most people think that when they go to the bank to get a loan, that what they're borrowing is the money that you or I may have deposited in the bank the day before or a week before. The chances of that being true are only about 1 in a million. Usually the banks are fully lent, and so if you go in for a loan, they have to create the money to lend to you. And the way the system works is this, that you go, let's say you want to buy a new car, it's going to cost you $35,000 that you need the cash for. So you go to your friendly banker and say to him or her, I want to borrow $35,000 to buy a new car. They say, okay, what collateral have you got? Say, do you have some stocks or bonds? And say, no. What about a second mortgage on your house or your cottage? Well, if they have that, that's fine. If not, they'll say, well, do you have a rich relative, a rich mother-in-law, or someone who will co-sign for you? And when they're finally satisfied with the collateral that they need to guarantee the repayment of the loan, then they'll get you to sign a note. And you sign a note for $35,000, usually at prime plus a certain amount, and you sign that, and then they tap their computer, and a $35,000 entry appears in your bank account, a credit that you can go out and spend in order to buy your car. Now, seconds earlier, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air, so to speak. And the way the system works is this, that they have a sort of double entry bookkeeping. And the note that you give them is put on one side of the ledger as a credit. And the money that they create to give you is put on the other side of the ledger as a liability. And this is the way they balance their books. And the way they make their money is really very simple. If you decided, for example, to not spend the $35,000 right away, let's say you saw something in the newspaper that the next year's models were coming out in 2 or 3 months, and they were going to be better value and have more bells and whistles on them, and you decided you'd wait 2 or 3 months or 4 months before you buy your car, and you left the money in your account, they would probably pay you 0 or, if anything, 0.25% or some ridiculously low interest rate for it while it's there. On the other side of the ledger, their side, they're going to charge you 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, depending on the era, percent of annual interest on your note. So the difference, the money they make is in the difference between the 0.25% they pay you and the 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 that they charge you. And that is called the spread. And that's how banks make their money. So basically, the more money they create, the more loans they make, the more money they make, because they have all of this increase in assets on the credit side of their ledger, and they're interest bearing. And so this is really, it's a great system. Well, the next important point, I guess, is how much of this can they do based on the reserves that they have. And the reserves are what they have as capital or as cash in their vaults or whatever, in case instead of spending the $35,000 for a car, you'd walk in and say, well, I'd like my $35,000 in cash. I'm going to the races. You probably wouldn't say that, but that's probably what you might have that in mind. And so if only a few people go in and ask for their cash, the system works. It's a system based on faith. But if everybody goes in and asks for cash at the same time, it's not there. And that's when you have bank failures, because they only have a minimum amount of reserve in order to make good on the deposits that theoretically can be exchanged into money, into legal tender money. So this ratio, really, of how many times they can lend the same money is something that is worth taking a quick look at.
Right, and as you point out, this ratio started historically, say, in the 4-to-1, but now is up to the 20-to-1 or even more.
Yeah, actually, it started at less than 4-to-1. When I'm talking about this subject, usually just go back as far as the Bank of England being established.
Okay.
King William was fighting a war and he ran out of money. So somebody said, well, why don't you get a bank established and they can lend you some? So he thought that was a good idea. And the rich people in London put in £1,200,000 in gold and silver and lent it to the king at 8% interest, which is a pretty high interest rate for a government guaranteed loan. To show his appreciation, the king said, okay, now you can print, print, £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend them to your rich friends at high interest rates. In other words, you can lend the same money twice, once to the king and once to your friends. Right. So they're lending the same money twice and collecting interest on it from both sources. Well then, as you suggest, over the years, that ratio has become much more generous due to the combination of the larceny of the banks and the cooperation of politicians. In the early years of the 20th century in the United States, federally chartered banks had to have a gold reserve of 25%. And that means they were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. In Canada, when I was young, the banks had to have a cash reserve of 8%, which means they could lend the same money 12.5 times. Well, then over the years, that ratio got up to the point where some banks, Canadian banks, for example, were lending the same capital, because they changed the system from money reserve to a capital reserve, the same capital 20 times. And some of the New York banks were as high as 20, some 30. There was one bank, I can't remember the name of it, a few years ago, that got up to 100 times. And of course it went broke because that's just a ridiculous ratio. And the reason that they're likely to go broke if they get the ratio too high is because of the value of their collateral. The value of their assets drops. Let's say that they have a ratio of 20-to-1. If the value of their assets drops by 5%, they're technically bankrupt. So that's all that has to happen for even the biggest of banks to be technically bankrupt, is for the value of their assets to drop by 5%. Well then, as you know, during the meltdown, 2007, 2008, stocks, for example, went down 20, 30%. Real estate went down, well, 20, 30, 40, 50%. And so most of the big banks in the world were technically bankrupt. And they were bailed out by the central banks, including the Federal Reserve System in the United States. And it's interesting, and this is a subject we can get into if you want to.
Yes, I'd like to get deeply into the Federal Reserve, because I think that the history of that bank brings us up to the circumstances that we find ourselves into today.
The Federal Reserve System is deeply into it, was partly responsible for what happened, and they bailed out the banks. They printed the money to bail out the banks, but they didn't do the same for the people.
Right.
So now the banks, in most cases, are doing all right. Not the little ones, but the big ones are doing all right. They're consolidating, they're making a lot of money, they're starting to pay these big bonuses again. And they're buying a lot of government paper and making money on that because they can borrow from the Fed for 1/4% and then buy government bonds and get 2 or 3 or 4%. And so the system is loaded in favor of the banks, who are really the perpetrators of this Ponzi, and loaded against the people who have to pay the taxes to pay the interest on the bonds that the banks buy from the government with money that was created out of thin air.
Right. Now, you point out a history of the Federal Reserve Bank going back to 1913. And there's some people who even say that the bank panic of 1907 was intentionally triggered by agents of the Rothschilds who came over to the United States to trigger that bank panic in order to set up the need for a Federal Reserve, which then they brought about in 1913. Perhaps you could recapitulate some of that story.
This is the kind of thing that people should read for themselves. And I would suggest that some of them get Ellen Hodgson Brown's book, Web of Debt, and just get the history of banking and what they have done and who was involved and the cooperation and collaboration that took place. And certainly the New York banks and the European banks were in collaboration with what happened in 1813, rather. No, 1913, excuse me, getting my centuries wrong here. In 1913, they were in collusion to get the Federal Reserve Act put through Congress. And what really was at stake, they didn't like competition. So they decided that if they could get a monopoly, a cartel, in effect, worldwide, then they could sort of divide up the spoils. And so that's what the Federal Reserve System was all about. They had the secret meeting in Jekyll Island, and a handful, 5 or 6 people, decided on what the legislation should be. First it failed because it was too obvious, but then they sort of fixed it up a little bit and got it through Congress. And it was probably the biggest heist in the history of the world. It's cost the American people trillions and trillions of dollars.
Yes, yes, and I recall coming across a document in a 1976 U.S. Senate subcommittee, and that subcommittee set out the beneficial ownership of all of the banks, private banks, commercial banks that own, and investment banks that own the Federal Reserve. And the beneficial ownership seems to concentrate itself in just a few wealthy bloodline families, so that we actually have this great concentration of the control of the world financial system in just a few families.
Yes, you hear different figures, but the one that's most commonly used is that about 100 rich families control the system for the world, and that they exercise a power which is just absolutely phenomenal. Now,
so that the Federal Reserve System is really a misnomer. It's a term that's intended to mislead because it's neither federal nor a reserve. It's not a true central bank. It's actually a private bank.
Well, it's a private central. It's a private bank that has all of the advantages of a central bank, and probably none of the disadvantages.
Right, and so now, Paul, of course, we're now at a very interesting moment, and I want to reiterate that today is July 13th, 2011. It's very hard to say what's going to happen, but here we have the United States with the US dollar as still the world reserve currency. We have the President of the United States yesterday coming out with a statement that would seem like it would, I mean, it's earth-shattering in terms of conventional politics. He said, well, I don't know if I can send out Social Security checks on August 3rd, which is at the beginning of the month. Those are 70 million checks. And that's the traditional third rail of American politics. And you have the Republicans and the Democrats have now broken off talks on the debt ceiling. And you have $10 trillion of public debt that has arisen since the administration of I mean, it has skyrocketed since the administration of George W. Bush in 2001 with wasteful foreign wars on essentially sole source private contracts with private companies that are owned by or operated by the vice president and other people. So there's this incredible self-dealing. And I'm just wondering how you see this incredible situation playing out.
It's very difficult to say, but what you're bringing in now is sort of the industrial military complex that President Eisenhower warned us about. And there is a direct connection between the industrial military complex and the banking cartel that controls the world monetary system. A direct connection, because the lines, as you suggest, run from the banking system through the corporation system. They have shares in the corporations, and they have interlocking directorates where the directors, the senior officers of the big corporations have directors' jobs in some of the banks, and they work together as a team to exploit the system. And our mutual friend Carol Rosen has said that when she was working with Dr. Wernher von Braun, the famous rocket scientist who came to the United States after World War II, that he had mellowed in his senior years and had warned about the military-industrial complex always having to have an enemy. And he told her that first it would be the communists, and then it would be the terrorists, and then it would be the extraterrestrials.
Right.
They have to have an enemy in order to justify these incredible expenditures for military operations. So as long as you've got an enemy, you can presumably go to Congress and say, oh, we have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars in order to prepare to fight the communists or the terrorists or the extraterrestrials or whatever it is. And therefore, we ask your cooperation, and we're sorry that we can't tell you all of the secrets that you would like to know and that you should know under the Constitution. But we'd like you to trust us and to give us these hundreds of billions of dollars to spend, even though the federal debt is climbing out of control. And so this is all part of it. Who gains the most when countries like the United States go further and further in debt under the present system? Well, it's the bankers of the world, because then they hold more U.S. paper money and they collect interest on it from the American people. And what happens to the poor American people? They lose their jobs and their benefits. And the whole thing is just absolutely backwards to what it should be. And this is the reason I say that there's got to be a public uprising. There has to be an American spring or a global spring under which the people of the world say, enough is enough. We're tired of being slaves, because in fact, people are slaves to the monetary system. They spend most of their life paying taxes to pay the interest on bonds that their government has taken out to finance their governmental affairs, and on their mortgages and on their credit cards, and there's just too much debt. Well, you say, why is there too much debt? Why is the United States so much in debt? Why is Canada, does it owe $600 billion in debt? Why is France so far in debt, and Germany and Greece, let alone Greece, I should say, and Spain and Ireland? It is because practically all money is created as debt. There's no other kind of money created. It's all created as debt. So if you want the economy to grow, somebody has got to borrow. And it either has to be individuals borrowing more through their credit cards or their mortgages on their houses, or it has to be governments. Somebody has got to borrow for the economy to grow. And right now you're seeing the reverse. You're seeing governments having to cut back because their borrowing power is running out on them. So, in my speech in Arizona, one of the things I said was that any high school student should be able to see that if all money is created as debt, that the total debt in the world is tending toward infinity, which means that there's no way that it can be paid off. In other words, the system is absolutely berserk, and it has to be changed, and it has to be changed soon if we're going to have any hope for, well, the future of the people who are now in such distress in the United States and in Greece and all over the world.
Now, you call for the abolition of the Federal Reserve Bank. And as you do here in Canada, you've called, I believe, for the reinstitution and for the enhancement of the powers of the Bank of Canada as a proper public central bank. Getting over toward the abolition of the Federal Reserve Bank, for which there is increasing popular support in the U.S. There are some Congress people who have proposed that, notably Ron Paul, although he says now he's going to leave Congress. Do you think that that's an outcome that can be reasonably accomplished?
Well, when you say reasonably accomplished, if you mean is it going to happen easily, the answer is no, because the bankers have the upper hand.
Right.
It should be accomplished, and I don't think there's a real future for the United States until they have abolished the Federal Reserve System and have either replaced it with a proper central bank or have nationalized the Federal Reserve and just taken it over and made it a government institution.
Right.
Most people think it's a government institution anyway, and they were deliberately lulled into believing this at the time the act was passed by calling it federal and calling it reserve. And as you pointed out, it's neither. It's just a bunch of private bankers who, in effect, have dictatorial power over the economy of the United States. And it's so bad, and I've seen it happen in Canada too, where they can decide who's going to get elected or get reelected by manipulating the economy. And if they get a president in they don't like, well, all they have to do is make life miserable for the people, and they'll vote against the president. Or they can do it the other way around. If they get somebody in that they really are happy with, who goes along with their industrial military complex or who is good for them, why, they can encourage that person by playing the strings properly in favor of their reelection. So it's a diabolical system. I was looking at something that somebody read to me a couple of days ago, or sent me a couple of days ago, about a speech Ben Bernanke made at the 80th birthday party for Milton Friedman.
Right.
Where he said to Milton Friedman and Anna Swartz that they were quite correct in saying that the Federal Reserve was responsible for the Great Depression. That the Federal Reserve had facilitated and then extenuated the Great Depression. A terrible admission, really. But of course what he said is, well, we're going to see that it never happens again. Well, I guess he had no idea when he said that how difficult it was going to be for the last 3 or 4 years. But he has gone partway towards preventing a depression, just far enough to save the big banks and keep the ship barely afloat. But the people are still suffering.
Exactly. And today, July 13th, 2011, marks the beginning of the secret meeting at Bohemian Grove, at which the federal, I believe that Alan Greenspan was actually brought there prior to his becoming Federal Reserve Chairman, and sort of, I guess there's secret initiation rites that go on there. I'm not quite sure right, but there are, just to give you some positive news, there is a demonstration planned today around the Bohemian Grove site by the people. People are just going to show up and start bearing witness. So I think that your words and those of others are starting to take hold. Now, let's get into what the good news will be once we work and can either secure nationalization or some sort of an abolition of the Federal Reserve. I was very struck by your words when you said, well, we could have, say, 34%, if I recall, of the money would be government money that is created by the central bank, and we would still have the commercial banks create 66% of the money. Why would we give commercial banks any role at all, given all the trouble that they've caused humanity over the last number of centuries?
I think this is where there's some difference between monetary reformers. One of the problems with monetary reformers for the last 150 years is that everyone has their own solution. And each one thinks that their solution is better than the others. But in fact, quite a few of the solutions would work, but some of them would work better than others. And there are many monetary reformers that would like the government to print all of the money. I have decided that that would not be the best solution because there are about three reasons. One, banking is a big industry, and I don't want to eliminate it. I want to put a halter on it, to bring it under control, to take away its power to run the world, and to take away its power to do evil, because it has been responsible for both the Great Depression of the 1930s and the recent meltdown of 2007-2008. This was established by the Pecora Commission, that a couple of New York banks had been responsible for the beginnings of the Great Depression, and as Bernanke indicated, the Fed made it worse and collaborated with them rather than saving the people. And then Charles Ferguson, in his excellent documentary Inside Job, shows that a couple of major Wall Street banks were responsible for triggering the meltdown of 2007-2008. So what I'm suggesting is to take away their power to be able to do things like that, and to split the responsibility for money creation between the government and the private banks in a way that will still allow the private banks to extend credit to small business people and for credit cards and this sort of thing, personal loans, and not have enough money to finance levered buyouts and to buy stocks on margin and to finance all of the crazy things that the banks have introduced in the last few years, the derivatives and the gambling aspect of the banking industry, which has become, incidentally, the principal aspect. There was a divorce between Main Street and Wall Street, and it was a complete divorce, and it's got to be ended. Now, if we were to go abruptly, well, if you go at all, from a system where the banks have some power to create credit to one where they have no power to create credit, then all of the little businesses would have no access to credit.
I see.
And it would have an absolutely devastating effect on Main Street. People like me that had to borrow money to build houses and to develop land and to do things creatively that people like me and entrepreneurs do. They start with a little idea, and then they persuade the bank to give them $5,000 or $10,000 in those days, $25, $50, $100,000 today to expand and to develop their ideas. If you took away their right to create money totally, you would wipe out that facility unless you reestablished it as a government institution. Now, frankly, after spending most of my life in money, I think they would be just as cronyism as the bankers are, and I think that they would use the money to perpetuate their own power rather than trying to do the best possible job for the people who elected them. So what I'm proposing is a system where they create, either through a central bank or like Lincoln did when he printed the greenbacks, through the Treasury. Either one will work, will create enough money that they do not have to run deficits, that they never have to borrow another penny from a bank anywhere, anytime, and that they can raise enough money in taxes and so on from regaining full employment to start paying off some of the existing debt and reduce it. And of course, if you had to have a 34% cash reserve, as I'm proposing, then within a very short period of time, they would in effect be taking over 34% of the assets of the banks. They would be reducing their assets by 34% and using a lot of it for paying off government debt. And so it's a system which will allow the world system to work for the people. It will restore democracy in the sense that with the reestablishment of a cash reserve system, governments, not bankers, will be determining how fast the money supply should increase, because at the moment it's the bankers who decide whether they're going to print X dollars or X plus Y. And they've been very erratic about it. So they print far too much money for a while, and then they slow down and cause a recession or depression. That should never happen. They should never have been a recession or depression. And there doesn't need to be one in future. But they've got to change the system so that governments have the power that you expect them to have in a democracy of complete control of the most important economic tool in the whole arsenal. And that is the power to create money. So all they really need, in my opinion, is enough to supplement their income from other sources to the point where they can balance budgets at all levels, federal, state, municipal, and there's enough for all of the legitimate purposes of government at these various levels, while still having a machine where banks are forbidden, totally forbidden, to do most of the things that they're doing today, gambling and promoting and funding hedge funds and all this sort of stuff. But leave them a very narrow, limited a margin of things that they can do. And that would be, in effect, the reason that they existed in the first place, at least theoretically. And that is to support the development of business enterprise and create jobs. And that's what they should be doing.
Good, good. Now, just to shift, we're just about 40 minutes in, and we're coming to the end of the segment. But I wanted to ask you, Paul, because you are probably the leading world statesman who came forward in this new century to speak about the extraterrestrial presence, and that brought the world dialogue to a new level. And I wondered if you could share with us what you see the future of this engaged world dialogue about the extraterrestrial presence, where it's going, where it relates to some of the subjects we've touched on already and what you see as the future for humanity as part of the larger intelligent civilization of species?
Well, first of all, you give me too much credit, I think, but you're raising one of the most important issues facing mankind today. And again, one which is not widely understood. As I said earlier, probably only about one person in 100 understands money, where it comes from. And the majority, I would say, although an increasing minority, do not understand the extraterrestrial presence and technology and its potential, because it has tremendous potential. But I think the first thing, as you know, there's a push on now for disclosure. I think it's imperative that the United States government and other governments make public what they know about the subject, because they know a lot about it, even though they deny it. They deny having any interest in the subject. But they've been back engineering alien technology for 60 years, and what they've achieved in that length of time is mind-boggling, as you know, and as a lot of our colleagues know. But the public doesn't know, and the chance of them knowing is not great, because there is a link between what I call in my book the cabal. This Light at the End of the Tunnel is not a book about extraterrestrials, but it has a full chapter in it for beginners, for skeptics who I think would find it of use and of benefit to read. And the cabal, that is the controlling group of the extraterrestrial technology, has direct links to the banking cartel. And so if you're going to crack one egg, maybe it would be just as well to crack them both at the same time, or maybe the second one would crack if the first one were cracked. And the reason I'm primarily, well, there are various reasons, as you know. I would like to know how we treat the visitors. Do we still treat them as enemy alien? Because, as you know, they were designated enemy aliens by General Twining more than half a century ago. Does that designation still stand? And if so, why? And what proof do we have that they are not benevolent? Because most of the evidence that I see indicates that in fact they are benevolent. And I know that there's always a rumor that there's one species that isn't, but no one has ever been brave enough to name it and say which one it is. So I'm on disclosure, so that we can talk about these things and say, right, well, where's proof? Let's have an inquiry and have you come up with some proof, and not just some misinformation or disinformation that you may be spreading around the cosmos. And to go back to my principal reason, I guess, for interest is I think that in cooperation with the extraterrestrials, that the cabal has produced exotic energy sources, and that they are essential to the switchover, the fast switchover from the oil economy to a clean energy economy, to use that phrase, in the 10 years that I think is the absolute maximum that we have. And it upsets me more than I can express in words to hear our leaders talk about drilling more wells in the Gulf of Mexico, or allowing more oil sands projects in the Alberta tar sands, or drilling for oil in the Beaufort Sea, and all of this sort of thing. It's too late for that. It's too late for more oil drilling. It's too late for wind farms. We haven't got time for all of that stuff. And we've got to do something, and we've got to do it now. And whether 10 years is fast enough or not, I don't know. But I took 10 years from my book because I don't think, knowing human nature and government in particular, that we can do it much faster than that. Because even to do it in 10 years, would require the same kind of mobilization that we had to win World War II, where we just put all of our energy into it, and we changed the industrial system around and really directed it towards a wartime industry, a wartime industrial system. And we have to do exactly that with directing the whole apparatus to using these new forms of energy, which we think exist, and using them to replace carbon wherever it's being used, whether it's automobiles or airplanes or electrical generating plants, whatever, just to replace one with the other and to do it during this 10-year time frame and make sure that it's done. Now, I'm convinced, if I was given the power to do it, I'm convinced that it could be done in 10 years if there was a worldwide determination that that be the priority project, that it is so important to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren that we just have to do it, and if we don't, we're absolutely, totally derelict. So that is what I believe. Well then, of course, that brings us right back to the other half of the problem, which is the monetary complex, the banking cartel, because until we give sovereign countries back their right, until they take back, more precisely, let's make that clear, they don't have to be given back anything. The countries own the right to print money. It's the people's right. The people own it. It comes down from the sovereign. The sovereign used to create all the money. So that in the United States, it's the Congress and the government that have the right to print money, not the Federal Reserve System. It was the Congress that gave the Fed the responsibility. Terrible mistake, because what they did in effect was say, here's the whole thing, you do it, and you benefit from it, instead of the people benefiting. So how can you call it a democracy when the most important tool in the economic arsenal is outside the control of government, when it's in the hands of a few private individuals who benefit from not solving the problems, who benefit from continuing the old system and continuing with the old problems. So there's a tie-up between what we have to learn on the monetary side and what we have to learn from the extraterrestrial side and how much has been accomplished. And we really have to try and find out what is in the minds of the people who have been developing, presumably trying to replicate space travel with American versions of flying saucers, and whether their intentions are friendly or whether they're not. And they've also been developing weapons, as you know, that are diabolical and can be used against people on Earth as well as visitors from outer space. And these are things that should be in the open, and the Congress should be debating them. Congress should be asking the questions of all of the people who have worked in what they call the black operations for the last few decades, and as well as the ones that are working in them now. And I guess about the only way that this is going to happen is if the Congress ever says, well, we're going to cut off your money until you come clean and talk. But then to quote from Light at the End of the Tunnel, again, I have in the chapter called We're Not Alone in the Cosmos, I quote from Jim Sparks, who was an abductee.
Right.
And he allowed me to put in a fairly lengthy quote from his book, in which he talks about amnesty. And he got this from the extraterrestrials themselves, because they're smart cookies. And they said, you're going to have to grant amnesty to these people to talk, because they have broken just about every law in the book. And you wouldn't expect people to go before a committee and tell the truth if they're going to wind up spending the rest of their lives in jail. So the Congress would have to repeal the Security Act or whatever it is, and or grant a special amnesty to anybody who has been working in this field and who is willing to tell the truth, because the truth must come out, and it must come out soon, because it too has been one of the major drains on U.S. financial resources. Nobody knows how much money has been spent on the black ops, and some of the estimates, as you know, run up into the trillions.
Exactly.
And does Congress admit this? And what were they doing when they were supposed to be exercising their constitutional right to know what they were voting money for? Because they voted a lot of money for projects that they didn't understand and that they couldn't really go out and say were essential because they didn't know what they were. So we've got a lot of tying up some special knots here, and or connecting the dots, as Paula Harris would call it, and changing the system right across the board, starting with the banking cartel, and then getting full disclosure from the people who really know what mind-boggling developments have taken place in the last 60 years.
But I think, as you point out, those two areas, number one, returning the people's sovereignty to the creation of money and to the creation of proper central banks, and number two, making the technologies that we know through whistleblowers and other sources now do exist in the national security state, and could, with a reasonable transition, make this planet a paradise planet.
Absolutely.
Yeah, those are two key issues. We've sort of reached the end of this segment, but I wondered, Paul, if there are any final thoughts. You have focused now on a survival plan for the human race, and I wondered if there are any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us about our survival as a species.
Well, I think, frankly, it is at stake. I know that the extraterrestrials are concerned about what we're doing with our planet, and that they think we're headed for disaster. And that's basically what my book is about. I say the world is going to hell in a handbasket unless we, the people, do something about it. We have the power to do something about it. Theoretically, we have the power, but we don't exercise it. And we're going to have to show the people who have been conniving and conspiring, if you want to use the word. Actually, it's not a word I like, but who have been manipulating our future for so long. We're going to have to take that power away from them, restore it to elected officials, and then say, these are the things that we want. And one of them is, we want you to start printing, if you want to call it that, or manufacturing money enough to end the recession, to end this massive unemployment all over the world, not just in the United States and Canada, but to get people back to work so that they're paying taxes, and those taxes then will balance the budgets, help balance the budgets in future. And we want it to be done now, and then we want you to take the surplus money and start spending it to save the planet before it's too late, and to, as you suggested, get the extraterrestrials to help and provide us with some of their medical knowledge, and to create the sort of paradise on Earth that our Canadian person, Wilbert Smith, talked about 60 years ago, after he had some direct information from the terrestrials who gave the impression that they were there to help us, but we have to ask for the help. We have to cooperate and not to continue to shoot at them and try and treat them as enemy persons. So there's some huge issues, and I just hope that people will say, okay, enough's enough, and we're going to do something. Incidentally, there's a website that I recommend, is www.victoryfortheworld.net.
Okay.
And the www.victoryfortheworld.net not only has my speech on that people could download,
okay,
It has some recommended books, but it also has some action plans.
Oh, good.
And for one for Canada, one for the United States, and one for the world. And this would be somewhere for people to go if they want to start getting together and preparing to somehow exert their authority and stop the rotten apples from spreading any further.
Excellent, excellent. www.victoryfortheworld.net. And it's about time that we had a victory for the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. We're certainly happy that you are here fighting the good fight, that you're sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us, and we wish you and all of us a future victory for the world.
Absolutely, and it can be done. Let's make sure that it is done, and that would be our legacy to our future generations.
Excellent. Thank you.